Hello, hello. Welcome everybody to this new edition of the I3h seminar. We are very happy today to welcome David Zarka and Philippe Vergauwen to present the seminar. We are, you all know Philippe, who was our dean, he's professor of management and control, and he's a member of the I3h team. David is teaching at the Faculty of Motor Sciences. And they are going to present interdisciplinary seminar. Since we are an interdisciplinary research center, I think it's perfect. And so the topic will be the impact of mindfulness on organizational control mechanism, a transdisciplinary theoretical framework. And so we are very eager and very curious to get this presentation, which will be, I'm sure, very exciting. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthias. Yes, I'm standing. I think first, it's a real delight to be here with David Zarka, a colleague, a dear colleague from the Faculté des Sciences de Motoricité, really transdisciplinary. He's becoming a very close friend, and we're extremely excited to be on the verge or at the beginning of what promises to be a very interesting multidisciplinary research adventure. The background, to keep it very simple, when I first met David Zarka, you start introducing yourself, and then you start telling and talking about what you do and where your research interests lie and what kind of courses you teach. And I was speaking enthusiastically about management controlling, strategic management control. And David says, well, are you sure you're talking about management control? Because I'm into mindfulness and I hear you talk about mindfulness without probably knowing it. So I listened to him, and he was very enthusiastic as a Parisian philosopher about mindfulness. And while listening to him, I said, well, that's exactly, but from a totally different approach and using totally different words. But what David is discussing, the effects of mindfulness on the well-being of a person, an individual, such that he can feel more at ease and make better decisions concerning his life and quality of life. That's exactly what, from an organizational point of view, a strategic management control system tries to do. Awareness to creating awareness with respect to the strategic objectives, implementing tools, techniques, models, frameworks, to make sure that the different individuals in an organization are motivated, know what they should do in order to contribute to the achievement of the strategic goals of that organization. So we started really discussing about, well, if we see the organization, the enterprise, the team as a body, as a totality, an entity, can we apply insights of mindfulness when we are discussing controlling? And can I, from a mindfulness perspective, use the ways of thinking of strategic management control in better defining or helping me to define the added value of mindfulness for society and businesses and organizations in society? So we got off on that trajectory, but we wanted to be very serious because this, you can say the same for management control. There is lots of graffiti and lots of, let's say, loose theoretical thinking or loose emotional thinking, and it's not bad. And for mindfulness, the same thing. If we talk, and I had the experience, if you talk about mindfulness to management, to businesses, they find it rather soft and esoteric. So what we knew the big challenge to be was to have a compass and to very, very specifically explain in scientific and academic terms what are we talking about and what are we not talking about. And we'd like to approach that from, let's say, the hard/scientific point of view to convince people that we are serious and not trying to sell kind of a product or a service in consultancy. I'm exaggerating a bit. but that is one of the biggest challenge. So we'll start with an introduction, brief introduction of what mindfulness and mindfulness meditation, mindfulness practices are, and about strategic management control systems, MCS. And then we define, we explore, and we try to do that in a very neat way. The parallels between mindfulness and control systems in what they try to achieve, why they are there, and to define some joint challenges to further both disciplines, to further both fields. We dive a bit deeper into mindfulness as an embodied approach of management control system, because David was able to redefine in a very value-added way what a control system, a management control system is from the viewpoint of mindfulness and mindfulness meditation, and then showing that mindfulness and mindfulness meditation can indeed be a driving motor of an evolving strategic control system. This means it can be very complementary to the management control techniques we use today. And then we'd like to have a lot of time for discussion. This is not a paper that presents findings and experiments and quantitative analysis, but it tries to define exactly where we want to go, and we will kind of end up with hypotheses that can be tested and which we will hopefully put in further research, combining neuroscience, measuring brain activity, and applying that to people in a situation where they have to make a decision under stress and or uncertainty. And we'll see whether mindfulness techniques can indeed complement the controlling tools we already have. And again, that have the purpose to make people contribute to the organization by making the decisions that will lead to the achievement of strategic objectives. Enough said as an introduction. I leave the floor to David now to briefly identify and mindfulness such that you can capture the main ideas. And I'll be back for controlling.
Thank you, Philippe. I'm David Zarka. So I will explain mindfulness meditation, what is it, and what's the difference between mindfulness and mindfulness meditation. So mindfulness meditation is an attentional-based practice to develop certain kind of perfection. This perfection is a wide, large kind of purpose, goal that can change in different contexts or different cultures. It's compassionate, or it's well-being, it's emotional regulation, or efficacy in actions. So mindfulness practice, attentional-based practice like meditation can be used for many different purposes. So when we see what is mindfulness is a brain states. That's the process that we cultivate during meditation to reach this purpose, this goal. We have in mindfulness, we develop two kinds of mental states. Shamatha term comes from Buddhism. Buddhism is a culture where they explain with many details what is mindfulness and the different depths. In Shamatha, it's a sustained attention. We concentrate attention to maintain attention. For Vipassana, and Vipassana is to monitoring what process is ongoing in my body, and to see this process and learn about this process. Let insights come from the body, and from these insights to have more information on how I work. With this information, I can better regulate my intention, my goal, my action. Mindfulness is a old practice. In many cultures, we can find practice like mindfulness in Buddhism, but also in other cultures, some in Europe, antique philosophy like Greek philosophy cultivates mindfulness like practice, spiritual practice here in its sense. now mindfulness emerged in the literature, scientific literature, thanks to neuroscience in very large panel of discipline, like medicine, psychotherapy, social science, etc. I will give the.
Yeah, but you can leave on. Thank you very much, David. You can leave on your slide because I'd like to start from this slide. If I am to briefly introduce or define what management controlling is about, we use exactly the same concepts in a different way, and the approach is different, but controlling is about self-regulated attentional stance oriented towards, and here already a difference, perhaps towards the achievement of goals, but in the now. And here you see is towards present moment experience. We are controlling is all about not keeping people small, but try to inquire, try to explore, try to innovate, but in a controlled way. And that can only be achieved by sustained attention and experiential inquiry. Yeah? So again, important overlaps. It's essentially multidisciplinary, as is management controlling. The nice thing now is that, and in the literature, there are already experiments, and I'm referring to the work of Dana Gailey, for instance, or on the work on nudging in a totally different discipline. That is, management control tries to influence the behavior of individuals. Like mindfulness tries to influence the decisions and the behavior of an influential in the future, but from do I understand myself? Am I in harmony with myself? And do I see the world as is, not as I want to see, but as is? And a world seeing and accepting the world as is also for an organization, a business, an important element to be successful. If you continue the world to see as you think it is, then you're not making the decisions that are appropriate in the world as it is. So if I make the bridge to management control is nothing but a structured, systematic use of all tools and instruments and techniques that allow organizations to focus on effectiveness and efficiency and on achievement of strategic and operational goals. Are we ready? Are we well positioned? Do we understand how we can achieve goals in the present situation, and how can we change the present situation if we need to change that? And businesses want, of course, to change the world where they operate. It is about the systematic influencing of behavior of individuals to incentivize and align them to contribute to the organizational value creation process in the context of limited resources. This is management, this is economics. If I say influencing behavior and align to contribute, we have the whole economic literature on principal agency behind us, whereas the personal individual interests are not automatically aligned with the organizational interest. The same from a mindfulness perspective. What you feel, how you are aware of your own personality physically and mentally in the world around you that can be conflictuous and very complex and difficult to understand, is that your personal incentives or your personal alignment does not always align with the world around you, which leads to conflicts, and conflicts can lead to unhappiness, lack of well-being. So again, we see that kind of corollary, that kind of correlation between the two. But how can we make it hard, and how can we really define what we are doing? Control speaks about goal congruence, agency theory, conflicts of interest, performance, action and goal, and evaluation, monitoring, assessment. And control is about having impact, effectiveness and efficiency. And probably David would say from a mindfulness perspective, it is to be a better person, a stronger person, better to understand the world. And you have techniques to reset your thinking, to fully accept. And we're taking the time, and we'll come back to the two key elements that are really the drivers of our joint research. That is the suspension of judgment. Do not always and certainly not in a context of uncertainty and stress and risk. Do not think an option theory in finance, for example, does exactly the same. Is what if we don't need to decide now? Can we reach a better decision in the future? How do I come to this interest with mindfulness? This is also born in a context here to I3h, is born on the whole transition from organizations in healthcare towards putting the patient central. It requires a totally different approach to your control system if you want to bring the patient centricity into every process you do inside the operation. Well, the same kind of exercise we're doing here with David Zarka, and let's try to find out whether mindfulness, hard stuff, mindfulness, proven tools and techniques can complement what a control system is trying to do. A control system just defined mainly, and I'm simplifying here, but capturing it all, avoid 3 traps in management. That's the strategic trap, and we know that from strategy, that is having a strategy of the organization that is not aligned with the outside world. So you live on an island, you think you live on an island, and you think you can freely choose your strategy and achieve your goals in the world to which you're not aligned. Well, that doesn't work. The whole literature on inside-out thinking, outside-in thinking correlates with that. A second managerial trap is the measurement trap. We want to measure a lot of things. Where are we? What are the KPIs? What is the balanced scorecard? That becomes a complex exercise, overly complex, such that people do no longer understand what you're absolutely asking them to do. And we often include non-important measurements, and we forget to include important measurements. So that's the measurement trap that brings or leads to, from a control perspective, to overly complex, unbalanced, unstructured, misunderstood goals and objectives, which do not lead to efficient and effective strategic execution in an organization. The third trap is the management trap, that is the misalignment of incentives. The knowledge transfer is not perfect. There is lots of information leading to problems of attentional dysfunction in the context of economists know that very well, moral hazard, imperfect and or incomplete information. Well, mindfulness has as the objective to have that sustained attention, and keeping attention on what is true and real is an important concept in mindfulness, as it is in control. So where mindfulness counters mindlessness, we know that every human being, and we can transpose that, and that's the interesting part, we can transpose that on an organization as well. An organization and an individual human being has a spontaneous tendency of the mind to detach from the here and the now. And we often think about the future and how we would like the future to be, but we're living in the now. So it's attention control that is needed to bring us back to the now and to the de facto situation. We also have a mind tendency and an organizational tendency to filter sensation experiences and build biased perceptions. We know that. We know that that's a problem in decision making as well. How can we control for that? From mindfulness point of view, from controlling point of view. And thirdly, we have a tendency to blindly react and automatically act when something happens. And here we know also from option theory is that not always having to decide now has value. That's the option value. The same in mindfulness, that is suspend your judgment and do not act before you have made the exercise of do I understand what it is? And it is in the suspension of judgment that the value of well-being is created. So too many overlaps, not to be interested in pinning it down and enriching both disciplines with what we know. This leads us to a couple of joint challenges. I leave the floor to David to explain to you what the biological and institutional organism behavior means as a challenge from a mindfulness perspective. I'll be back with approaches to systematically regulate behavior of organisms, which is the purpose of a control system. David, the floor is yours.
I continue on the overlap or the parallel you can make between biological and institutional organisms. In both organisms regulate the body to move in the space and achieve some goals. And both organisms use anticipative and predictive models based on feed-forward and feedback mechanisms to move and act in the reality. And this organism build a representation of self and environment, have intrinsic and extrinsic interest and motivations, and exert executive control on themselves to move and achieve goal. All this organization must regulate their resource because we have always in limitation resource. So an example here in human and everything for us, every of us, we need to manage the tension between the daily demands and the challenge in everyday life versus the well-being and the development of our the regulation of homeostasis and the disease and not avoid some problem health problem. In a parallel institutional organism must manage the tension between short run and optimization versus long run and robustness of an organization. It's some parallel we can make between a biological institution and an institutional organization. On this kind of parallel, we can see if management mindfulness insight can be applied on institutional organism to favor maybe long-run resilience in something like that. So I may give Philip to continue.
And again, these are the two main applications. Remember, it is about sustained attention and attentional control. Attention is functional, and the suspension of judgment to prepare for analysis and go into the deep dive and make the exercise is what we have to do today in the short run, still coherent, consistent with what we want to achieve in the longer run. It brings us to two major challenges in controlling, that is, and it's exactly the purpose of control systems, how do we link the day-to-day short-run decision-making and how do we incorporate that in a system that also has a balanced and secure look on long-term interests. And we see, and specifically in terms of prices, you see that organizations that have a more balanced and controlled approach to short-run, long-run, to survival and optimization versus resilience, and exploration and growth and innovation, react better in terms of prices, as opposed to organizations who always want every day the last drop out of the pot, that are extremely focused on optimization. And optimization, we know, it's always limited to the constraints. You optimize something with respect to constraints. Now, if constraints suddenly change in the world around you, which happens in terms of shocks and crises, your optimal problem can be your optimal point, or your equilibrium can suddenly be no longer an optimal point or an equilibrium. And if control systems are overly focused on short-term operations, you might not even see that. So that is the big challenge for organization, which exactly management control systems try to complement or to address. So the main point here is, what if we consider an organization as an organizational institutional entity? And what if we consider the organization as what in mindfulness is defined as a body, a personality, a body, an individual. Can we use techniques to increase awareness in mindfulness? Can we learn from that and make our control system better? And then we come to, as an embodied approach to NCS with surprising results. David.
Mindfulness and management control system systemic approach to systematically regulate behavior of organisms, like we said before, and to refine model-based strategy, integrating changing context. Both, as we see before, use the capacity of organisms to exert an executive control on themselves and to better balance between resource, interest, and strategy. On the capacity to let, for mindfulness, the crucial point is to let the insight emerge from consciousness of our biological function, from information from the body. So mindfulness, the key point of mindfulness is meta-awareness, capacity to see how our organism regulates themselves. So both mindfulness and management control system try to achieve rational, resilient, successful, sustainable performance in the context of the goal we put purpose for them. And they try to reach this goal with increased expertise, less erratic, and more balanced way. So the key elements in mindfulness, we said that before, the management, the judgment suspension, its capacity to not project our wish or something like that on the future, but to come back in here and now and see what is emerged in the present moment. What is the reality actual currently? To suspend the judgment can help us to have a meta awareness. So how this works? Why my body or my institutional organism function like that, and what is the problem or what is the good aspect of this functionality. And another key point is acceptance. It's not easy to recognize some limitations that we have, or to see how good we can have. It's sometimes difficult to recognize good aspects of our functionality too. Another point very important is the capacity to maintain judgment suspension, meta-awareness, and acceptance in the long term, so, enough to see its functionality and with time. And to see how the function evolved with the time scales to let the information and the insight emerge. If we maintain judgment suspension, meta awareness, and acceptance on some like short little second, it's not enough. We must to maintain this brain states most of the time, if possible, to see how functionality and to better understand how we work and how the institution works.
And again, in the language of management control, we do have controls that are related to judgment suspension. What do organizations typically do when they have to make an impactful, serious decision? They organize meetings, they use committees, they prepare a project, and at the end of the project, during which they did some analysis, they come to a final decision. So that is, in a way, it's judgment precision through interactive controls. You can also see in the control literature that there are boundary controls. That is that if somebody, a manager on a certain level, wants to take a decision, and because that decision might be risky or might be taken on incomplete or imperfect information, it's brought 1 or 2 levels up. And then you say you need authorization to make that decision. So that is next to an interactive control, also a boundary control. But the essence of judgment suspension is, of course, if you implement that through those boundaries of interactive controls, you need to organize the meetings where people do suspend their judgment, because you can easily imagine that you have a meeting to talk about a certain problem, but that both parties with opposing views, for example, come to that meeting, not with an open-mindedness to discuss and learn from the other, but to defend their own points and go for what they like to achieve in, let's say, the more political context of an organization. And these are kinds of meetings that take time, that cost energy and are costly, but do not contribute to better decision making. So how can we use mindfulness techniques or mindfulness concept to redesign these interactive controls and these boundary controls to make sure that these meetings do have the added value they want to create? Another example, I'll come back to patient safety. The first reaction is, well, if we have to include patient and if we have to put the patient center, we know that from a production point of view, because we for instance, we work on a medical treatment that helps individual patients get better cure or care. But putting the patient center, patient centricity is much more than that. That is involving the patient also in the development and even in the conceptual development of a new treatment or a new cure. And that requires in your controlling system that you implement and that you integrate metrics in the diagnostic system that are related to patient centricity, that you give the patient a place in your interactive controls, of course in your système de croyance, your belief vision, but also in your boundaries. How do you work with patients in your governance structure? So these questions sont pas anodins. And the first reaction is always, this is going to be more costly. This will lead us away from profit optimization or whatever other operational goal. But in the long run, you can only survive and be optimal in the long run if you succeed in doing that. So what kind of techniques can we use that are effective and efficient to get to that better functionality of a control system? So the focus on the inner organism functionality of controlling, whereas mindfulness counters spontaneous tendency to anticipate, judge, and expect. A control system wants to achieve the same things when it is creating added value, when it contributes to decision making in better control. Of course, a control system wants people to anticipate, but anticipate in the right way. Of course, a controlled system leads people to a better judgment, but only if the judgment is a better judgment, and so on. And so we allow factual and unexpected feedbacks from inner lower level organisms. This is exactly the purpose of your interactive controls. In a strategic control system, you want to accept emotion regulation from a mindfulness point of view, but you want to make sure that the incentives and the feel right of people are aligned when you have decisions to make, because you can make decisions that people disconnect from, and then you will run into operational and executive programs. The decision is made, but it is not carried and it's not fully integrated by the people who are responsible for execution. Enabling the development of higher metacognitive awareness underlying executive control. Again, It's exactly at the core of management control. Therefore, I think one of the most interesting elements, concepts, and its partial analysis is to go deeper, to dive deeper into the importance of judgment suspension, the ability of executive control to reduce tensions by heightening non-oriented awareness and disrupting the tendency of oriented decision-making processes to minimize, stifle, or ignore signals which do not fit the current model that you think is the best model in the world, in the complex world around you. Well, you can feel already, if you read the sentence, that if an organization is not able to make its executive control to reduce these tensions, you will run into problems and you're certainly not optimizing and you're certainly not going to achieve your strategic objectives. So the inner organism functionality and the judgment suspension is all about how can we integrate inner organism feedbacks and taking some time, necessary time before immediate judgment and action taking. And we can only do so if we are lucid enough, if there's discernment, and if there's allows insights to emerge, taking into account the real state of the organism in its here and now situation and environment. And this arguably leads to a more adequate decision-making, more balanced behavior by avoiding overly, purely intentional actions that could hinder adequate action execution. So if we're talking about summarizing a bit, the levers of control that work with boundary systems, structures, organigrams, diagnostic systems, KPI, performance metrics, analysis, spreadsheets, with interactive controls, how do you share the knowledge, how do you work together, and how do you work together with your important stakeholders, and your value system, your belief system. If we put them next to or against the mindfulness components of attention control, lower level organism signals, emotion regulation, awareness, and purpose, we have an organism or an organic behavior where stability and agency is important, embodiment, sensibility, empathy is important, clarity, acceptance, discernment is important, changing of perspectives, changing of goals is important, resonance, flexibility, fluidity, evolvement is important, and we are talking almost about the same things, not always with the same purposes, but let's investigate how, from an individual organizational point of view, workers, leaders, body, and what is the role of leadership here, how we can talk more sensible and with more depth about the problems of how do we link the short-run versus optimization versus the more long-run resilience strategic objectives of the organization, and how do we marry, align kind of the soft and more informal controls that are very important, interactive controls, belief system approach controls, with the hard and formal parts that we all know, the KPIs, the balance scorecards, the organigrams, the functional, the task analysis, and so on. And what does that imply for change and innovation? Again, few words about the three traps. The strategy trap, the measurement trap, and the management trap. It's a bit more concrete now. We can link the management trap with emotion regulation, the measurement trap with body awareness, and the strategy trap with attention control. And this makes that it's at least a very promising and exciting journey to do a deep dive in some of the specific practices of mindfulness and of some of the specific and recognizable practices in controlling. But again, a change of perspective on the self from an organizational point of view. The challenge in controlling is to move from a static, narrative, often ideologic self to a flexible, embodied, experienced self in a fastly changing world. The cognitive diffusion, the ability to gain psychological distance from an internal experience, is important, certainly for innovation. Think of out of the box thinking, putting patients in healthcare situations more centric than your own basic logistic operations and so on, all with the purpose of trying to design and execute a better balance between quantitative controls and here and now self-modeling enabling organizational flexibility. So concrete in organizations, connecting the balanced levers of control with mindfulness traits. The missing link here is leadership, but we'll come back to that. We're preparing a second paper on that, the importance of leadership. And then again, we move into the management literature on serving leadership, but it's not nonsensical. We can make these discussions much harder and even in a way much more scientifically rooted than, let's say, intentional or emotional or intuitive. There's much more behind leadership than just intuitive approaches, which we too often see. It's about leveraging the effectiveness of control and leadership impact, and mindfulness can indeed be argued to make individuals less dependent on or mitigating effects of control leadership imperfections. So this is also about the resilience of the organization. Our point, and this is what we will elaborate upon in follow-up papers, that is that ideally the combination or seeking, expliciting the complementarity of mindfulness and controlling leads and will lead to a clearer, more scientific, less intuitive, more proven, and we can go even into neuroscience to prove. I'll give an example later on the role of leadership, which is in management and in economics often still regarded as too soft, not scientifically based, more management than economics, and there's a bit of lack of hard stuff proof. So, for the conclusion and the discussion, from a mindfulness perspective, the fundamental function of the mind is to highlight conditioned processes that can constrain the individual emancipation and self-realization. Could we consider a controlling system, which is a social practice exerted by management to orient the behavior of the people in the organization? Can we consider this as a way to organizational emancipation and self-realization and make the organization much more effective in reaching its strategic objective through the behavior and contributions of individuals? And can mindfulness leading to extended attentional function complement or support control systems, formal control systems, to fully contribute to the deployment of the organization? These are the main reasons why we do this research. And just to give you an example, we know, for instance, that if you put people in a situation of stress and complex decision-making under uncertainty, the better decisions are made by people who are able to activate more brain functions, and you can see that on charts with colors and neuroscientific measurements, than people who do not activate all those areas in the brains. And let it be the interesting case that those who come to better decisions activate, and we can visibly in a hard way show that, activate brain functions that are triggered and activated by mindfulness techniques. So there is also a hard approach to that, and that is what makes us so happy, that we'd like to dive deeper into that, run some experiments with people that are given a case, for example, that does not mention patient centricity, but based on the same numbers, versus a case where you have the same numbers, the same strategic goals, but that do mention patient centricity. And we hope to see, for example, in that case, is that the notion of patient centricity will trigger additional brain functions and allow you to come to what is then called a more effective, efficient, or better decision. That is the journey we have decided to venture on together, and it's a pleasure to continue the work with David. But the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks a lot. Who wants to ask the first question? Caroline.
Yeah. Maybe it's not a question, but more a remark, because I'm practicing Vipassana meditation. And a few years ago, I watched an interview or a conference of Yuval Noah Harari, so the writer of *Sapiens*. And he said something that really, so it's not a question, but it's something that really touched me. He said, how can you observe the world? Because he's kind of describing the world through his book. And he said, how can you observe the world if you cannot even observe your own breath for more than 10 seconds? And I found it very I don't know. And I know that in the management and in the economic world, time is money, but just to take some minutes a day just to observe the breath and to, I'm trying to practice this as much as I can. And it really helps me to evaluate or to readjust my actions. So just to take the time to observe and to then act. So it's not a question, it's just
to take attention on the breath. It's the first step of meditation and vipassana path. It's very difficult to maintain attention to this breath and to see how our body is reactive when we do nothing, just look to your breath. And this is the key point of mindfulness, is to just wait and see how your body react to the act to do nothing, just do nothing, and you see how many thoughts you have, how many emotions you have, and can you just see that and be with that. You have insights that emerge that to see how you are. I think this process to take attention to you is a key point to self evolve to, and I think this key element can be used in organization to evolve the organization, to allow organization to be better in function of context and the purpose that the organization give to themselves. The key point in mindfulness is that the goal, the why you practice change when you practice. When you begin mindfulness, you make mindfulness because you want to be Zen. You want to be cool, well-being, something like that. So, but when you practice when we practice robust practice, you goal in the practice change because your comprehension of yourself change, and as your comprehension of yourself change, your goal on the practice change, and you understand that you want to be Zen, and this contradicts the objective to be Zen. You can't be Zen if you want to be Zen. You must to stop to want. If you want to be Zen, it's I don't know if you understand what I want to say, but it's a contradiction between the mind in the future. I want that, and the here and now, and it's here and now. Just see what is it, and maybe you can be Zen, but maybe not.
My reaction to that would be that that's exactly a challenge, and not an easy one. We know, all of us, we know that if we're more in control, if we take the time to do these kind of mental exercises, which sound again a bit too tough to link that with doing hard business, where it's all about direct performance measurement and rentability or profit. We know from an individual point of view that these kind of exercises are useful, make us better, make us more relaxed. It's also helps you fighting stress. It takes a big difference of the world around you. But suddenly these same individuals come into an organization and do not see the organization with the kind of same organic needs. And suddenly this becomes individual. You can do that in your own time. And if you do that, that's okay. But don't get this kind of stuff into the organization. That's not what organizations are for. It can lead to an intentional good reaction, but it will not work. That is that the organizations that say, well, okay, it's not nonsensical, let's try to do something, let's try to implement mindfulness techniques, and let's organize every Monday morning a session where we put people on the tatami, exercises to control their breath, and then we suddenly are a more mindful organization. No, it doesn't work like that either. So what we're trying to find out is what exactly is the kind of conceptual and strength of mindfulness techniques and tools, and how can we, without loss of business sense and business focus, introduce that, and not only on the level of methods and techniques in using tatamis and yoga, but how can we redesign control systems with using the concepts of mindfulness. And we already see that modern management control systems try to do that, but forget about important links. So our purpose is to dive deep, no nonsensical, so no nonsense, to dive deep and to make that analysis, knowing that the ultimate purpose of a business and its control system is different from opponents will say, well, what you're trying to do is use mindfulness techniques to even be better in exploiting people to bring them to better organizational results. And your interest is not the individual well-being, but is how to further exploit, make people through mindfulness more efficient, more effective for your organization. Well, point taken, yeah. Part of that is even, I will not say true, but the purpose of the organization is to bring people together to achieve certain organizational goals with limited financial resources. So we have to be careful for that as well. So two things are the biggest challenges for us is how to, in a no-nonsense way, in a accepted by business and by mindfulness, an enrichment of what we are doing in our disciplines, without falling into the trap of let's just introduce yoga sessions and then we'll be fine, or no, you cannot do that because you're exploiting people and it's their freedom, and you do not only want more awareness because it benefits your bottom line profitability. So that is what we have to be very careful and clear about. But we know already, and it's so crucial, and I'm looking at Hilde here, that the notion of patient centricity is changing not only business models and operations, but also financing models in healthcare. And that's a hard fact of life.
But can I ask you, because I'm wondering, do you expect differences between, I would say, on the one hand, the healthcare sector as a whole and other fields, other sectors, and then within the healthcare sector between care facilities and organizational settings such as pharma, biotech?
I think you will find differences because the purpose of these organizations are different. So the control systems will be different because they will lead to differences in strategic goals. And then it's, you could say it's an academic exercise, but what kind of tools are more efficient in the one situation than the other, and remaining open to the criticism of from a well-being point of view, you should do more than just try to better exploit people through mindfulness. Yeah, but that's an open discussion, and we're also there. But it's not only patient centricity. I can imagine that if you really want to go to a successful, proven, and carried through, and where people align to a sustainability strategy, and that you have to do exactly the same. It's not by putting two KPIs in your diagnostic card without changing value systems and boundary systems and interactive controls that it's going to work. This fundamentally changes in the sense of awareness, sustained attention control, suspension of judgment, because you're doing something new and you don't know the results. Take the time to find out what the results are. And how can we do that in a formal, controlled way? And the objectives, our objectives are different, but there's too much in common to ignore each other.
Michel has a question.
Yes, that's very. Can you hear me?
Yes, Michel.
Yeah, so thank you very much. That's very interesting. Actually, I saw that I knew mindfulness as something that, each of us can practice to become better, but now I understand that it can be, included in management system, which is quite interesting. Actually, but that's more a joke, perhaps not really a joke. I think that ULB could be an excellent environment to implement mindfulness more extensively than it is. Now,
You cannot say so. I couldn't possibly comment.
now, now my question is, because all this is quite convincing, but what about the translation into practice? First, I might ask, do you know about, some big companies which include now mindfulness in their management control system? But the other question that I have, because this is also a personal experience, as you know, there are assessment centers which are used by many companies and public institutions. Myself, I spent a horrible day in the Hudson Assessment Center before I went to the commission. And I was wondering whether in this assessment center, in a way or another, the capacity of future manager indeed to include mindfulness in their way to operate is taken into consideration.
You want to say something? No. Well, Michelle, thank you very much for the comment. And yes, we often and we see lots of examples also in real practice, but these examples are not, to my mind, if you ask me, well structured enough, or they can benefit from a framework, a stricter framework that we're trying to work on to help them to make it to bring it together and to offer a more structured approach. Lots of examples you see in the whole literature about nudging and about how in our university context, and there's experiments done by Dan Ariely, and you also have the whole Freakonomics, Dubner and Leavitt experiments. But it is proven that in certain contexts, and I'm not so sure it'll work in the ULB context in exactly the same way as in the Maastricht or in the Paris context or at an American university context. But we see, for example, that if you put students in a hall where they have to do an examination, spending 2 minutes on asking students to stand up and pledge together that they will not engage in trichery, fraud, that it has impact on less fraud. Yeah? It is an effective way of controlling. And this, you can say, is a mindfulness technique because it brings the awareness on what are we doing, and you confront the individual with a lot of people in the hall that are looking at you and you want to contribute to the group, and you pledge, you say something, and it's not anodin that you try not to fraud. Yeah? It doesn't exclude fraud in a hard way, but these are kind of techniques that we see in reality, but they lack for me a structured approach where you bring them together and where you give them a formal place in what we call control systems. There are other examples, students, you can ask students to do a pledge. The whole discussion on awareness with respect to diversity and inclusion. It's a well-known fact, and I did it myself in my classes years ago. Again, a case study, a calculation, a financial calculation that was done in a German company with a CEO that was called Klaus Grübner, and the same data and the same context. The only things we changed was that it was a Greek company with the CEO of Papadopoulos, yeah, and the results were completely different. Yeah. We have to be aware of such things. And again, with respect to diversity and inclusion, and I'm not focusing on that, but if you want it to work, and that is what the control question is, that if you decide, you can decide not to, and that's a completely different discussion. But if you decide you want to include it and make it work, then you have to do something in a formal way. What can help you in doing that in a formal way? That's exactly the questions we're trying to answer.
Yeah,
Yeah, I don't know if I may have another question. You know, I had the chance in my career to have some personal contact with a few CEOs in the pharma sector, and I was quite impressed by the fact that usually they have close to them a person with whom they meet, I don't know, once a month or something like that, discussing, you know, general things. And I'm wondering whether it's a way for them indeed to practice mindfulness. Any comment on mindfulness on the CEO side?
I think there's lots of experimenting on C-suite level, and because we have an intuitive feeling that that kind of mindfulness can help, and then you do team building activities or you start a meeting in a different way. Just as another example, a faculty meeting at St. Mary's College in Halifax, and I happen to know the school because I was on a peer review, an active peer review team there. They start the meeting by saying, we honor the land of the natives and we want a prosperous society for all. Yeah? Again, you can be very counter to this contraire à cette idée, in the sense that that's all bullshit. And yeah, of course, if people around the table are not interested and go through the motions of yes, okay, that's done, then it will not work. Eh? Again, what we're focusing on is not in a direct way implementing mindfulness techniques in a way that probably is not really part of the design of a control system, but using the concept to make sure that what you capture or what you seemingly capture on an individual level through mindfulness, which has an effect, by the way, also in leadership teams. That's why companies organize team buildings and organize these sessions. But we would like to go much further and say, well, how can we make it a formal part? We give me one last example. There is nothing so formal as governance structures in an organization or a company. We know that in corporate governance, we moved from a CEO who was also a chairman even of the board of directors to a non-executive director to solve some of the agency problems. And now we move into the question, is it interesting to have an independent, not only a non-executive, but an independent chairman? What can you do by changing the governance structures and allowing an independent chairman to enter? Well, this is about bringing in other things from the outside world. This is hopefully to increase the awareness of what is this company doing in a competitive context in the business world and even larger society. There are links to what we can formally do and what we can do on an individual level. It is exactly the purpose to explore and make hard what hard things we can do and what things we can explain that we're already doing by making the link to mindfulness and the other way around.
Thank you, Philippe.
Yes, the point is not to impose mindfulness to all people in the organizations. The point is to understand how mindfulness works in individual to make a better involvement of individual, to adapt this to organization. Yeah. And this don't work by implement mindfulness techniques in organization, but maybe if manager understand what is mindfulness and maybe practice for themselves mindfulness, maybe they can understand what is mindfulness, and maybe when they are enter in a relation with other people in the organization, they can accept some thing, or they can change their behavior with other to better contribute to the development of the organization. So if there is one point where mindfulness practice can be useful to this in our works, and concretely it's to develop maybe mindfulness for manager, not to make them more zen, but to in the perspective that they understand what is mindfulness and how this works in themselves, what are the key points in judgment suspension and acceptance and some concept like that to apply this concept in organization, in relation with other, and to better contribute from their perspective, from their role in the organization, of the development of the organization. So,
and again, if you make the bridge, so what we are not trying to do is defend mindfulness techniques and make sure or hit the road and say to every organization that they should introduce yoga classes or whatever. That is not the point. It's what David says. How can we make sure, or how can we better understand what we're trying to do in controlling by looking at the similarities, the complementarities of mindfulness and management control. And it can be that you can improve certain processes, certain actions, certain activities by directly including mindfulness techniques, but that's not our main point. Again, the main point is to better understand how we can bring people in an organization to better achievement of strategic goals while being more proud and more contributing and not at the cost of the individual. So not at the better exploitation of the individual, on the contrary. Again, leadership, coming to leadership, the whole discussion in the literature, leadership literature on serving leadership, authentic leadership, and so on, each of them is kind of graffiti on the wall. And they're not nonsensical, but if you see, well, and there are case studies, Harvard, Stanford, on the impact of authentic leadership on the performance of an organization. Well, if you look at authentic leadership, there's a whole overlap with mindfulness, awareness, sustained attention, suspension of judgment, better communication, or more effective communication. Why would we let that lie left or right if we can use that to better understand what we're trying to do in an organization? What is that? I see your hand.
Hello?
You raise your hand. I thought you had a question.
Stable.
Otherwise, I'm happy to ask a question. Okay. So I think thank you for an interesting presentation. If I want to challenge a little bit, the tension I see is that, okay, I can see mindfulness as I'm not an expert, and I don't do any of that, but maybe I should. But I can see the value of this potentially from an individual point of view. Okay, be better aware of potential costs and benefits, challenges, risk, SWOT analysis, all these kind of things, and be happier, more relaxed, and so on. Okay. At times we have similar objectives, and at times we have competing objectives, and therefore I'm afraid, of course, you want leaders who have emotional intelligence, which means that they can explain the good side of what they want. They may be good at hiding the bad side of what they want. I mean, obviously, if I sell industrially produced chicken or veal or whatever, the last thing I want is let the consumers understand how I raised them. Let's face it. When I want to run a company and my shareholders who are the bosses, this is capitalism, that's how it works. I want workers to be to be to think they are part of the family, so that they work hard until all of a sudden they are not part of the family anymore, and they have 15 minutes to empty their office and disappear. So, and when you look at how companies talk to investors versus workers versus consumers, it's at time completely opposite. So you want people to be aware of some things and unaware of other things. Now, how do you, because my understanding is that mindfulness is also an ethical way of viewing things. So how do you bring that together? I see that as a bit of a challenge, you know. It's like, you know, greenwashing, all these kind of things. So of course, everybody wants to look good. The question is, what are the mechanisms by which you will do it in a useful way, and in a way where, let's be honest, on some things we have a joint interest, on others, sorry. You know, how would mindfulness be useful today for the less company, for example? For example. Very good question. I think you can answer that. Is your judgment and your accept?
Yes, it's we have an opposite objective and regarding the organization, and we are in individual as individual different. We have contradictions. So first time in mindfulness is to see these contradictions, to accept these contradictions, and to let's see. Mindfulness don't give the solution for when we are opposite, when we have different strengths or goals in the individual or in the organization. But how we can mindfulness can it's a mindfulness meditation is a formal structure to make more clear the tension and the different aspect of a question, and to let these different contradiction works, and to see how this contradiction can discuss and maybe better see where is the most important point, where is the less important, and to find a solution. Emotions and mindfulness give us the framework to regulate and to make sometimes achieve some transformation of how we see the world, because this conflict transforms us. And this is a key point in this mindfulness, is how conflicts, not the conflicts in the under the stable or something like that, but how we can access this conflict and let's use this conflict open. Let's enforce act in a safe space where we don't have a problem with in a safe space, and final resolution that comes from this conflict.
Okay.
And when we see capitalism and some force here in society, it's how we can open this an area when we can discuss and we can understand all together in the
And I think it's a very interesting answer. Let me maybe rephrase it with an economist's jargon. So basically, you're saying, look, ideally, we should kind of sit around the table, make sure that we all understand our own costs and benefits, and let's try to agree whenever we can agree. At times, agree to disagree, but at least make the best of it and try to go to a more efficient content. Find ways to share it in a mutually profitable way.
Yeah.
At the same time, when things change, people to lose, and therefore, at times people will think, okay, I'm no stronger. I will use my increased bargaining power to screw you, and okay, maybe you will lose more than I gain, but I will gain, so that's fine with me. So the question will be, in a changing environment, how do you maintain these kinds of things? But I agree that it should be, of course, then there is still the question, do I want to play open book, or do I want to
all part of the game.
My weaknesses and stress their weaknesses and so on. But okay.
No, but I think that's all part of the game, as you say, and nobody, I think, around the table, especially not us, has the idea of, if we can do this, then we will solve every problem and we will get rid of every conflict of interest, or we will make life more agreeable for everybody. Because business is about, an agency and organization is about conflict of interest, and management is about how you manage these tensions instead of getting rid of them or thinking that they're not there. I also think this can help, Matthias, but it's up to every organization to do that for itself. But it can help to make sure that, to help organizations to better internalize some of the externalities that they're responsible for, without saying that businesses or organizations should internalize every care and worry of the world to become a good company. A company is still a company. And shareholders are still owners of the company. And you can even go to the extreme by saying the only societal purpose of a business is to make profit. That's the Milton Friedman. Yeah. But in order to have long run profitability and in order to contribute to society, there's a duty for regulation, but that's not our concern. But what a company can do, and why not accept that it can and will do so only because it's out of self-interest, it can help you internalize these factors that make you a better company, a better employer. What that choice eventually is, that's not our discussion. What we try to do is, what is exactly the purpose of controlling? How can you design a system that helps achieve the strategic goals as you have defined them? We're not claiming that we're going to solve the discussion on how to make everybody happy in whatever company you work for. No, that is not our words. Yes. I have to look. No.
Yeah, I can hear you now. So sorry. Yeah, I could not hear. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? No. Hello.
Yeah. Now.
Can you hear me? Yeah. So I could not hear for 15 minutes. So I may say things that have been said already. So I was a little puzzled by your first bullet point, actually, because after that, my understanding is that mindfulness has nothing to do with the search for perfection. As you said, you live in the moment, and it's actually you shouldn't find an objective for mindfulness, which is also linking to the control and to the idea that organization could use mindfulness in a certain way to create individuals that are more amenable to control and therefore enhance the performance of the organization. My view is that in a certain way, mindfulness will create something like a better world for, as you said, reciprocity, listening, And there is actually a literature in economics about that. Ernst Fair and Klaus Schmidt have worked on, the role of reciprocity in agency relationships, how it changes. And there things can go many ways, because if not everybody is reciprocal, some people can get advantage. But I was thinking for organizations, there may be an immediate benefit beyond, the usual control structure. You have organizations are stressful, especially hierarchical organizations are stressful. If you have a bad boss, it's a source of stress. And there has been in the recent years, if I'm not mistaken, an increase in what's called burnouts of people. So is there any evidence, for instance, that mindfulness will reduce stress and potentially reduce the frequency of burnouts? That's one point. And the second thing is also in your narrative, you have the organization, which is something, and employees who are doing mindfulness, but organizations are also, people.
Mhm.
And indeed, executives are actually doing a lot of mindfulness. So the question is, what will happen when the design of the organization is done by people who are more mindful? The design itself. So I think you hinted at that by saying, there may be more teamwork, for instance, maybe more listening, etc. But let me go back to my first question about the relationship between mindfulness and stress and the frequency of burnout. Is there any evidence that there is a correlation or no correlation? Because that will be one first immediate efficiency gain for organizations, right? Beyond the complicated effects of, can I extract more surplus from people who are more mindful if I'm not mindful myself and are reciprocal?
David?
Yes. First, about this first bullet about certain kind of perfection, yes, because when we want to meditate, we need to have a goal. We want to make mindfulness just for mindfulness. We have a goal, and this goal changes when we practice mindfulness. And this kind of perfection is not is the perfection what we project for the future, but this is an idea, and this change with self progression in the practice. So for the burnout in the organization, I think yes, if employers want, or employees and all people in the organization want to practice mindfulness, it can reduce burnout. I think we have a lot of literatures on mindfulness and burnout, and to see that mindfulness prevent or help people to have a burnout more reduced in time. We have many literatures in nurse for nurse, where she and he have many burnouts, and some literature shows that can help if it practiced with in a good way. Maybe sometimes if the practice is not good, or it's not well accompanied, we can have some case of we make this difference in mindfulness literature between empathy and compassion, and empathy can be trigger some burnout, where compassion can help to prevent burnout and to have a burnout with less longer. For the organization, what is an organization where employees are more mindful? I think it's depends to the context, and I think that if all employers and all people in the organization are more mindful, they will find a structure that can help to the organization to achieve their goal in a flexible way in function of context and the purpose of the organization.
I would be more, so can I?
Yeah.
I mean, economists are pretty.
By the way, if I may, maybe indeed, Patrick, maybe short, and then I think Edouard has a question.
Okay, so I will pass. But
No,
I think it's more complicated because listening is a good thing, but listening may enable you actually to do things that are more beneficial to you rather than the others, because you understand them better. So these effects are complicated, and I think again, the economics literature, maybe there is some work on that showing that actually it can backfire in a certain way. So these are very interesting questions, but it will be nice to have data. So for instance, it will be nice to know if organizations where you have mindfulness, if the targets given to agents have changed in a positive or negative way. Because if mindfulness reduces stress, you may push them a little more, you see. So
No, but exactly.
These are very interesting questions, and I think it's we need some type of data work on indeed on that.
Yeah, but we're focusing on the step just before that. We're focusing on what do we see that is already there in purpose and in execution of management control that can be understood by using the concept of mindfulness. Because if we say that mindfulness is just thing that we add, and by the way, you also have to do mindfulness that it doesn't work. The strong point is that we already can identify processes, instruments, tools that are very strongly recognized and embedded in mindfulness, and that we already recognize in what controlling tries to do, but that we can do probably better or in a more structured way. So that's point one. Second, then we would go for these types of experiments, and there I fully agree. But the purpose is always sustained attention, better decision making, and achievement of the goals set by the organization. It is not how can we introduce practices in and to make people happier. No, that's not the circle. We stay and remain within control, yeah, and David will stay within mindfulness, but to see how do we understand controlling in the full way, and can we not improve control systems to achieve the organization's objective with sustained attention and suspension of judgment? The experiments will go towards that, not towards
Philippe.
Yeah, Edouard. Merci.
Well, can you hear me?
Yes, Edouard.
Okay. I have actually two questions. The first one is the number of people and level which need to be trained to mindfulness for this model to work. Because I have some experience in this, and not everyone is receptive to the concept of mindfulness, number one. And number two, some people who are not receptive have a lot of problem understanding a leader who is himself in a mindful world because they just don't relate. So question to me is, in a mid-sized or large-sized organization, how many level of people do you expect to be trained to mindfulness for this model to work? That's number one. Number two, you refer several times to patient centricity, which I have used in my career. And I wondered why you link that particularly to mindfulness. I don't a priori see the link, because the mindfulness, as you explain it, is something which is going to modify the way the interior of the company is working, while patient centricity is, on the contrary, linked to the external world and the patient, etc. So I have problem understanding why you were saying that. Those are my two questions.
Perhaps let me start answering with the second. I think that's exactly the purpose also of mindfulness, is to bring the internal organism at ease and in a state of awareness and sustained attention, and suspicion of judgment to better interact, understand first, and better interact with the external world. So I think I brought patient safety as an example to the table because it changes the state or the necessary state of awareness of what a company is trying to achieve. Yeah? And by implementing or integrating the patient and his or her concerns and the interaction with the patient, you have to change, and that we see already done in organizations, that you put the patient, you bring the patient into your interactive controls. How do you control the process with the patients? You bring him into your diagnostic controls because you start measuring the quality of the interaction and what the interaction leads to. You change your boundary systems in the sense that the participation can have either a role, and just as an example, on governance levels, or there is a department, or there is somebody specifically responsible for patient organization interactives through a departmental structure or through a project, doesn't matter how, and you bring it into your value system beliefs by expliciting that the ultimate purpose is in a very profitable way, but serve the interest and patients first. Patients first, given an expected level of profitability. So I think it's not a contradiction. I think mindfulness is a way, conceptually, just like the control system is meant to be, it is to bring in a sensitive way, purpose and performance driven, a better connect to who you are, we are in the business environment you operate in. So that with respect to the second question. The first question, how many people do you need to train? Perhaps that's a secondary question in the sense that I don't know. And I am not so sure whether you have to train individual people in an organization to make the organization much more mindful. Again, the purpose from my point of view at this stage is how can we integrate mindfulness concept to improve the efficacy and the efficiency of a controlling system. Anyway, a control system is a system that allows the organization to operate without having every single individual knowing every detail and mixing and meddling with every decision making. So it's an efficient way to make sure that people understand what they're asked to do and that they can deliver what they're asked to do. And in the design of the control system, how can we use the concepts of mindfulness to refine, to redesign, or to add or delete some parts of the control system by thinking and using the control? But would you like to answer to that?
Okay.
So what we try to do now is, what happens if we consider the organization as a body as considered by mindfulness, and what comes out of that theoretical conceptual thinking? Does it lead to interesting hypotheses? Does it lead to interesting discussions with respect to management control? Here we've succeeded. Do we have answers how to? No, but that was just the purpose. But the two questions you put are extremely relevant and very much to the point. But we don't, and I certainly don't have the answer. But I do not think about individual mindfulness techniques. That's not what it's really about.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Are there other burning questions? If not, one question and then we close.
Yeah, because you mentioned many benefits of the mindfulness, but what's the potential cost, especially for the organization to do this mindfulness? Also, like, I think it might be difficult to do in a big company like the government. You have the central government, you have the state government, and then you have many divisions under that. So the mindfulness means that you have the realization of your current situation.
Yeah.
So for this government, it's really difficult to do the mindfulness. Right?
Yeah. Well, rephrase your question. How can mindfulness reduce the transaction costs of an organization? That's a transaction cost approach. That's exactly what we're trying to find out, or look to interesting areas to do research. So again, it is not about should organizations, and the answer can be yes, but that's not my point. The question is not should organizations invest in individual mindfulness techniques? No, the question before that is, can we understand and redesign, use and make control systems much more effective if we use management mindfulness thinking in designing control systems and giving people the place that that will enable them to perform even better.
Okay, well, thanks a lot. I think it's past 2 o'clock already, so but because it was
thank you.
It was a very exciting discussion, presentation. Thanks to everybody. Presentation, questions, and so on. Michel, you? Oh, okay. Thank you, and see you soon.
See you. Nice discussions.